Elderly woman loses home to bank after late payment. What she finds in the attic changes her fate. Hello, welcome. Leave a like, subscribe, activate notifications, and enjoy this story. She had spent her entire life in that house. Every corner, a reminder of the love, the loss, the sacrifices. But now, with just one letter, everything Margaret had ever known was slipping through her fingers. The bank didn't care about the years of memories, the late payments, or her age. All they wanted was what she no longer had. As she sat in the living room, staring at the walls that had witnessed decades of her life, something stirred inside her. Desperate and alone, Margaret made her way up to the attic, dusty, forgotten, and untouched for years. What she finds there will turn her world upside down in ways she never imagined. But is it too late to change her fate? Margaret's story isn't just about losing a home. It's about confronting the past, facing impossible choices, and discovering that sometimes the most life-changing moments are hidden in the most unexpected places. What she finds will test her strength and challenge everything she thought she knew. The harsh ring of the doorbell shattered the quiet of Margaret Wilson's modest suburban home in Millbrook, Connecticut. At 78 years old, with arthritic hands and a back bent from years of hard work, Margaret shuffled to answer it. The delivery man's cheery, "Good morning," contrasted sharply with the cold, official-looking envelope he thrust into her trembling hands. Margaret's heart sank as she recognized the bank's logo. With shaking fingers, she tore open the envelope, her worst fears confirmed as she read the impersonal typeface. Notice of foreclosure. Your property at 1423 Maple Street will be repossessed in 30 days due to non-payment. The words blurred as tears welled in Margaret's faded blue eyes. This house, her sanctuary for over 5 decades, held every memory of her life with George. From their first night as newlyweds to his final breath 2 years ago, these walls had witnessed it all. Now, because of one late payment, just one, it would all be torn away. A choked sob escaped her lips as Margaret crumpled the notice in her gnarled fist. The sound echoed through the empty rooms, a stark reminder of her solitude. She stumbled to the worn armchair by the window, sinking into its familiar embrace as she had countless times before. Outside, children laughed and played, oblivious to the devastation unfolding behind Margaret's lace curtains. Staring at the faded wallpaper, Margaret's mind raced. How had it come to this? She and George had always been so careful, saving every penny. But his long illness had drained their resources, and her small pension barely covered the essentials. One missed payment had snowballed, and now, the weight of impending homelessness pressed down on Margaret's frail shoulders. Where would she go? What would become of all their cherished possessions, the physical reminders of a life well lived? As panic threatened to overwhelm her, Margaret's gaze fell on the small door in the ceiling, the entrance to the attic. In all their years here, she had never ventured up there. George had always handled storage, insisting the steep ladder was too dangerous for her. Now, driven by a desperate need to escape reality, even for a moment, Margaret found herself pulling down the creaky stairs. Dust motes danced in the weak sunlight, filtering through a grimy window as Margaret emerged into the musty space. Boxes and trunks, relics of forgotten eras, crowded the low-ceilinged room. Her arthritic hip protested as she gingerly picked her way through the clutter. A particular trunk caught her eye, weathered leather with brass fittings, tucked away in a shadowy corner. Margaret recognized it as one of George's old army footlockers. With trembling hands, she unlatched it, lifting the heavy lid. The scent of old paper and faded ink wafted up, stirring long dormant memories. Inside lay dozens of envelopes, yellowed with age but neatly bundled with faded ribbon. Margaret's breath caught as she recognized her own girlish handwriting on the topmost letter. With reverent care, she slipped the letter from its envelope, unfolding the delicate paper. Her eyes widened as she read the opening lines. "My dearest Margaret, if you're reading this, it means I never found the courage to give it to you in person. I'm writing to the woman I hope to become, the one who follows her dreams and lives life to the fullest." Tears splashed onto the aged paper as Margaret realized what she held. Letters she had written to herself as a young woman, full of hopes and dreams for the future. Letters she had forgotten ever existed. As she read on, transported back to her 18-year-old self, Margaret's heart ached for the vibrant girl she once was. The aspiring artist who dreamed of painting in Paris, the adventurer who longed to backpack across Europe, the fiercely independent spirit who swore she'd change the world. What had happened to that girl? Life, with all its responsibilities and compromises, had slowly eroded those dreams. Marriage, children, mortgage payments, each a pebble that diverted the river of her ambitions until they ran dry. Margaret's hands shook as she opened letter after letter, each one a poignant reminder of roads not taken. The weight of regret threatened to crush her until she reached the final envelope. Unlike the others, this one was addressed in George's familiar scrawl. Her heart pounding, Margaret carefully opened it, wondering what message her late husband had left. As she read, her eyes grew wide with disbelief. "My beloved Maggie, if you're reading this, I'm no longer with you. I hope you'll forgive me for keeping this secret, but I wanted to ensure your future. Years ago, I made an investment in your name, a trust that should have matured by now. The details are with our old lawyer, Tom Hardwick. This money is yours, darling. Use it to fulfill those dreams you set aside for our family. It's time for you to soar." "Oh, my love, George." Margaret's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a gasp. An investment? A trust? Could this be real? Could this be the answer to her prayers? As the implications sank in, a spark of hope flickered in Margaret's chest. For the first time in years, she felt the stirring of possibility. If this trust existed, it could save her home. More than that, it could give her a second chance at the life she'd once dreamed of. With newfound determination, Margaret carefully gathered the letters. Each step down the attic ladder felt like a step away from despair and toward a future filled with potential. The foreclosure notice lay forgotten on the floor as Margaret reached for the phone, her fingers flying over the familiar numbers of Tom Hardwick's law office. As the call connected, Margaret took a deep breath. She didn't know what lay ahead, but she knew one thing for certain: her story was far from over. At 78 years old, Margaret Wilson was about to embark on the adventure of a lifetime. The faint aroma of coffee wafted through Margaret's small kitchen as dawn broke over Millbrook. She hadn't slept a wink, her mind racing with the possibilities unveiled by George's letter. Now, as she cradled a steaming mug in her weathered hands, Margaret spread the bundle of letters across her worn oak table. With trembling fingers, she opened the first envelope, dated June 15, 1964. Her own youthful handwriting stared back at her. "Dear future me, I graduate high school tomorrow. Can you believe it? The world feels so big, so full of promise. I wonder where you are now, what incredible things you've accomplished. Are you living in a Parisian garret, painting masterpieces? Have you hiked the Andes or sailed the Mediterranean? Whatever you're doing, I hope you're happy. I hope you're free." Margaret's vision blurred as she remembered that bright-eyed girl, so full of hope and ambition. She'd dreamed of attending art school in New York, of traveling the world with just a backpack and a sketchbook. How different her life had turned out. She reached for the next letter, dated 2 years later. "Dear future me, I met someone. His name is George, and he makes me feel like I can fly. He supports my dreams of becoming an artist. We talk about traveling together, seeing all the wonders of the world. I hope whatever happens, we never lose that sense of adventure." A bittersweet smile tugged at Margaret's lips. She and George had been so in love, so full of plans. But life had a way of derailing even the best intentions. Letter after letter chronicled the gradual shift in Margaret's priorities. Art school deferred when George lost his job. Travel plans shelved when they discovered they were expecting their first child. Each decision seemed small at the time, each sacrifice made willingly for the family she loved. As she read, Margaret's heart ached for the roads not taken, the dreams left unfulfilled. She thought of the half-finished canvases gathering dust in the basement, of the travel brochures still tucked away in a drawer. The final letter, written just before her 30th birthday, hit Margaret like a punch to the gut. "Dear future me, I don't know who you are anymore. I look in the mirror and see a stranger, a tired housewife with paint-stained hands that haven't touched a brush in months. I love George and the kids more than anything, but sometimes I wonder, is this all there is? Will I ever see Paris? Will I ever finish a painting again? I hope you found a way to balance it all. I hope you didn't forget how to dream." Tears streamed down Margaret's wrinkled cheeks as she finished reading. She hadn't balanced it all. She had let her dreams slip away, one small compromise at a time. But then her eyes fell on George's letter, and a flicker of hope reignited in her chest. Maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe this mysterious trust could be her second chance. With renewed determination, Margaret reached for the phone. Tom Hardwick's office wouldn't open for another hour, but she could leave a message. Her fingers shook as she dialed, anticipation building with each ring. "Hardwick Associates, this is Jenny. How may I direct your call?" Margaret's heart leapt at the unexpected human voice. "Oh, I need to speak with Tom Hardwick. It's Margaret Wilson. It's about a trust my late husband set up." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Wilson, but Mr. Hardwick retired last year. His son, James, has taken over the practice. Would you like me to connect you with him?" Margaret's hope faltered. Would this new lawyer even know about George's trust? Would he be willing to help her? Yes, please," she managed to stammer. As the hold music played, Margaret's mind raced. What if this was all a mistake? What if the trust didn't exist, or worse, what if it wasn't enough to save her home? "James Hardwick speaking. How can I help you, Mrs. Wilson?" The young man's voice jolted Margaret back to the present. She took a deep breath and began to explain about George's letter and the mysterious trust. As she spoke, her voice grew stronger, more confident. This was her chance, perhaps her last chance, to reclaim the dreams she'd set aside so long ago. James listened patiently, his tone growing more intrigued as Margaret's story unfolded. "This is certainly interesting, Mrs. Wilson. I'll need to look into our records, but if such a trust exists, we'll find it. Can you come into the office this afternoon? Say 2 p.m. Margaret's heart soared. Yes, of course. Thank you so much, Mr. Hardwick." As she hung up the phone, Margaret's gaze fell once more on the scattered letters. Each one represented a fork in the road, a dream deferred. But now, at 78 years old, she felt a familiar spark igniting within her. It wasn't just about saving her home anymore. It was about honoring that bright-eyed girl who'd written those letters. It was about finally becoming the woman she'd always dreamed of being. Margaret stood, her arthritis forgotten in the rush of excitement. She had an appointment to prepare for, a future to reclaim. And for the first time in years, she felt truly, vibrantly alive. As she moved to gather the letters, a small notebook slipped from between the pages. Margaret picked it up, her breath catching as she recognized her old sketchbook. With trembling hands, she opened it, revealing page after page of half-finished drawings, scenes from a life unlived, adventures never taken. In that moment, Margaret made a silent vow. Whatever came of this trust, whatever challenges lay ahead, she would not let these dreams slip away again. It was time to pick up the paintbrush, to book that flight to Paris, to live the life she'd always imagined. The road ahead was uncertain, full of potential pitfalls and obstacles, but as Margaret clutched the sketchbook to her chest, she knew one thing for certain. Her story was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. Margaret's fingers drummed nervously on her worn leather purse as she sat in the sleek, modern waiting room of Hardwick Associates. The plush chairs and abstract art were a far cry from the cozy, wood-paneled office she remembered from her visits with George years ago. She felt out of place, like a relic from another time. "Mrs. Wilson?" A young receptionist with a kind smile approached. "Mr. Hardwick will see you now." Heart pounding, Margaret followed her down a long hallway. The click of her sensible shoes echoed against the polished floors, each step bringing her closer to potential salvation or crushing disappointment. James Hardwick stood as she entered, his welcoming smile a carbon copy of his father's. Mrs. Wilson, please, have a seat. He gestured to a chair across from his imposing desk. As Margaret settled herself, clutching George's letter like a lifeline, James's expression grew serious. I've spent the morning going through our archives, he began, and I have to say this is quite an unusual situation. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. You found something? James nodded slowly. There is indeed a trust in your name, established by your late husband in 1975. However, he paused, his brow furrowing, there are some complications. The hope that had been building in Margaret's chest began to deflate. What kind of complications? James leaned forward, steepling his fingers. The trust was set up through a now-defunct investment firm, Pinnacle Financial. When they went under in the late 80s, many of their assets were tied up in legal battles. Your trust appears to be one of them. Margaret's mind reeled. She vaguely remembered the Pinnacle scandal. It had been all over the news, with accusations of fraud and mismanagement. But George had never mentioned any connection to their finances. So, what does this mean? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. James sighed. It means the funds are there, Mrs. Wilson. Quite a substantial sum, actually, but they're currently frozen, caught up in ongoing litigation. Margaret's hands trembled as she absorbed this information. But I need that money now. The bank, they're going to take my home. Compassion flashed across James's face. I understand, Mrs. Wilson, and I want to help. But we're dealing with a complex legal situation here. Unfreezing those assets won't be easy or quick. Tears welled in Margaret's eyes. After all the emotional turmoil of the past day, to come so close only to have hope snatched away again, it was almost too much to bear. James seemed to sense her despair. He leaned forward, his voice taking on a determined edge. But I'm not giving up. There might be a way to expedite things given your circumstances. I'll need to make some calls, pull some strings. Margaret looked up, a glimmer of hope rekindling. You do that for me? James smiled warmly. Mrs. Wilson, my father always spoke highly of your family. He considered George a dear friend. I'd like to think I'm honoring that friendship by helping you now. For the first time since entering the office, Margaret felt herself relax slightly. Thank you, she whispered. I don't know what I'd do if... Her voice trailed off as a new thought struck her. James, she began hesitantly, this trust, do you know why George set it up? Why he never told me about it? James rifled through some papers on his desk. There's not much information here about the motivation, but... He paused, pulling out a yellowed document. There is a letter of instruction from George, dated the same day the trust was established. Margaret's heart leapt. May I see it? James handed her the document, and Margaret's eyes filled with tears as she recognized George's familiar handwriting. My darling Maggie, if you're reading this, it means I'm no longer with you, and you've discovered the trust I set up all those years ago. I hope you can forgive me for keeping this secret. I know how much you sacrificed for our family, your dreams of art school, your plans to see the world. Every time you set aside one of your own desires for us, it broke my heart a little. This money is for you, Maggie, to fulfill those dreams you put on hold, to become the woman you always wanted to be. Whether that means taking art classes, traveling to Paris, or simply living comfortably without worry, the choice is yours. You've given so much of yourself to others. Now it's time to live for you. All my love always, George. Margaret's tears fell freely now, smudging the ink on the precious letter. All these years, George had known, had seen her struggles, her quiet regrets, and he had planned for this moment, wanting to give her a second chance at the life she'd dreamed of. James cleared his throat gently, giving Margaret a moment to compose herself. Mrs. Wilson, he said softly, I promise you, I will do everything in my power to get you access to these funds. It won't be easy, and it may take some time, but I won't give up. Margaret nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. As she carefully folded George's letter, she felt a strange mix of emotions swirling within her. grief for the years lost, gratitude for George's foresight, and a tentative hope for the future. What do we do now?" she finally managed to ask. James's expression turned determined. "Now we fight. I'll start by contacting the lawyers handling the Pinnacle case. We'll need to prove the urgency of your situation, gather documentation about the foreclosure." As James outlined their plan of action, Margaret found herself sitting up straighter, her chin lifting. Yes, there were obstacles ahead. Yes, the path forward was uncertain. But for the first time in years, she felt a fire igniting within her. She thought of the young Margaret who had written those hopeful letters, of the dreams she'd set aside. She thought of George, quietly working to give her this chance. And she made a silent vow. Whatever came next, she would face it with courage. She would fight for her home, for her dreams, for the life she'd always imagined. As she left James's office that afternoon, the weight of uncertainty still pressed upon her, but alongside it was something new, a spark of determination, of possibility. Margaret Wilson was ready to reclaim her story, one page at a time. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, a deceptively beautiful day that belied the turmoil in Margaret's heart. As she sipped her morning tea, her gaze kept drifting to the small stack of letters on her kitchen table. Each envelope held fragments of a life unlived, dreams deferred, and now, perhaps, a chance at redemption. With a deep breath, Margaret made a decision. If she was going to fight for her future, she needed to confront her past. It was time to revisit the places and people she'd left behind in pursuit of the life she thought she was supposed to live. Her first stop was the Millbrook Community Center. As she approached the weathered brick building, memories flooded back. This was where she'd taken her first art class, where she'd fallen in love with the smell of paint and the feel of a brush in her hand. Inside, not much had changed. The same linoleum floors squeaked under her feet, and the scent of turpentine hung in the air. Margaret's heart clenched as she passed the open door of the art studio, glimpsing easels and half-finished canvases. "Maggie? Maggie Wilson, is that you?" The voice startled her out of her reverie. Turning, Margaret came face to face with a woman she hadn't seen in decades, Claire Dawson, her old art teacher. Claire's face lit up with recognition, though her eyes widened at the changes time had wrought. "My goodness, it's been, 40 years? Margaret nodded, a lump forming in her throat. "Hello, Claire. I hope I'm not interrupting anything." "Nonsense. Come in, come in. I was just setting up for today's class." Claire ushered her into the familiar studio. "What brings you back after all this time?" As Margaret settled onto a paint-splattered stool, the whole story came pouring out. The foreclosure notice, the discovery of George's trust, the legal complications. Through it all, Claire listened with growing concern and sympathy. "Oh, Maggie," she sighed when Margaret finished. "I had no idea, but I have to ask, why did you give it all up? You were so talented, so passionate." Margaret's gaze drifted to a student's unfinished landscape, eerily similar to one she'd abandoned all those years ago. "I thought I was doing the right thing," she whispered, "putting my family first. But now I wonder if I made a terrible mistake." Claire reached out, covering Margaret's trembling hand with her own. "It's never too late, you know, to pick up a brush again, to follow your heart." Tears welled in Margaret's eyes. "But what if I've forgotten how? What if I'm not the same person anymore?" A knowing smile crossed Claire's face. "Art isn't about being the same, Maggie. It's about growth, about expressing who you are now. All your experiences, your joys, your sorrows, they've made you who you are. Imagine the depth you could bring to your work now." As Claire spoke, Margaret's gaze was drawn to a small painting hanging in the corner, a vibrant street scene of Paris. With a jolt, she recognized her own signature in the bottom corner. You kept it?" she gasped. Claire nodded. "Of course I did. It's always been one of my favorites. I use it to inspire my students, to show them what's possible with passion and dedication." Margaret stood, moving closer to examine the painting. She barely recognized the bold brushstrokes, the confident use of color. Had she really created this, As she stared at the canvas, a memory surfaced of late nights in this very studio, dreams of the Louvre and Montmartre filling her head as she worked. The girl who painted this had been so sure of her path, so certain of the life that lay ahead. "I was going to go there," Margaret whispered, more to herself than to Claire. "To Paris. I had it all planned out." Claire's voice was gentle. "It's not too late, you know. Paris is still there." Margaret turned, a wry smile tugging at her lips. "At my age? With everything that's happening?" "Especially at your age. Especially now." Claire's tone was firm. "Maggie, listen to me. You have a chance here, a chance to reclaim those dreams. Don't let fear hold you back. Not again." As Claire's words sank in, Margaret felt something shift inside her. The weight of regret that had been pressing down on her began to lift, replaced by a tentative hope. I don't know if I can," she admitted, "but I think I'd like to try." Claire beamed, squeezing Margaret's hand. "That's my girl. Now, why don't you stay for today's class? Just to observe if you'd like. But I have an extra easel if you're feeling inspired." For a moment, Margaret hesitated. But then she thought of George's letter, of his desire for her to live the life she'd always wanted. She thought of James Hardwick, fighting to unfreeze the trust. And she thought of the young woman who'd painted that Parisian scene, full of dreams and ambition. "You know what?" Margaret said, a spark of determination in her eyes. "I think I will stay. And I think I'd like that extra easel." As Claire bustled off to set up the materials, Margaret took a deep breath. She knew the road ahead was still uncertain. The threat of foreclosure still loomed, and there was no guarantee James would succeed in unfreezing the trust. But for the first time in years, Margaret felt truly alive. As she picked up a paintbrush, feeling its familiar weight in her hand, she made a silent promise to herself. Whatever happened next, she would face it with courage and creativity. She would honor the dreams of her younger self and forge a new path forward, one brushstroke at a time. The following week passed in a blur of nervous anticipation and cautious hope for Margaret. She'd thrown herself back into painting with a fervor that surprised even her, spending hours in Claire's studio, rediscovering the joy of creation. But as the days ticked by without word from James Hardwick, anxiety began to gnaw at her once again. It was a crisp Tuesday morning when Margaret's phone finally rang. James's voice crackled through the line, tight with tension. "Mrs. Wilson, I've made some progress, but I think you should come down to the office. There are some things we need to discuss in person." An hour later, Margaret found herself once again in the sleek confines of Hardwick Associates. But this time, she wasn't alone in James's office. Seated across from her were two men in expensive suits, their faces set in stern lines. James cleared his throat, his usual warm demeanor replaced by professional detachment. "Mrs. Wilson, these gentlemen are from Apex Financial. They're representing the interests of the investors in the old Pinnacle Trust." Margaret's heart sank. She'd known this wouldn't be easy, but the cold, assessing gazes of these corporate lawyers made her feel small and insignificant. The older of the two men, his silver hair neatly combed, leaned forward. "Mrs. Wilson, we understand your predicament, but you must understand, the funds in question are tied up in extremely complex litigation. We can't simply release them based on one individual's hardship, no matter how unfortunate." Margaret's fingers clenched around her purse. "But it's my money," she protested, her voice wavering. "My husband set it aside for me. Surely that counts for something." The younger lawyer shook his head, his tone patronizing. "Ma'am, hundreds of people lost money when Pinnacle collapsed. Many of them are in situations just as dire as yours. We have a responsibility to all the stakeholders involved." As the lawyers continued to explain the intricacies of the legal situation, Margaret felt a familiar sense of helplessness washing over her. It was the same feeling she'd had all those years ago, watching her dreams slip away one compromise at a time. But then, unbidden, an image flashed in her mind, the painting of Paris she'd rediscovered in Claire's studio. She thought of the bold young woman who'd created it, full of fire and determination. And something inside Margaret shifted. "No," she said quietly, cutting through the lawyer's explanations. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to her in surprise. Margaret straightened her spine, meeting the gaze of each man in turn. "No," she repeated, her voice stronger now. "I won't accept this. That money was set aside for me by my husband, who worked hard his entire life. I've sacrificed my dreams, my ambitions, everything, for decades. And now, when I finally have a chance to reclaim some small part of that, you sit there and tell me it's too complicated." The older lawyer started to speak, but Margaret held up a hand, silencing him. "I may be old, and I may not understand all your legal jargon, but I understand right from wrong, and this is wrong." She turned to James, fire in her eyes. "You said we could fight this, so let's fight. I don't care how long it takes or how hard it is. I'm not giving up." For a moment, the room was silent. Then, to everyone's surprise, James broke into a wide grin. "Mrs. Wilson," he said, admiration clear in his voice, "I was hoping you'd say that." He turned to the Apex lawyers, his demeanor suddenly all business. "Gentlemen, I think we've heard enough. My client has made her position clear. We'll be pursuing every legal avenue available to us to release these funds, and I suspect the press would be very interested in hearing how your company is treating a vulnerable senior citizen." The lawyers exchanged uneasy glances. It was clear they hadn't expected this level of pushback. "Now," James continued, "I suggest we reconvene when you're prepared to discuss a more equitable solution. Mrs. Wilson's home is at stake. I trust you'll keep that in mind as you consider your next move." As the Apex representatives gathered their things, clearly flustered, Margaret felt a surge of triumph. It wasn't over, far from it. But for the first time, she felt like she had a fighting chance. Once they were alone, James turned to her, his expression softening. "Mrs. Wilson, I have to say, that was impressive. You've got more fight in you than most clients half your age." Margaret chuckled, surprised to find tears in her eyes. "I suppose I do," she said softly. "I'd forgotten that for a while." As she left the office that day, Margaret's step was lighter than it had been in years. The road ahead was still uncertain, fraught with legal battles and potential setbacks. But she was no longer the helpless old woman waiting for fate to decide her future. She was Margaret Wilson, artist, dreamer, fighter, and she was ready to take on whatever challenges lay ahead, one brave step at a time. As the golden light of late afternoon filtered through the dusty attic window, Margaret sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by a lifetime of memories. After the confrontation at James's office, she'd felt a renewed sense of purpose. If she was going to fight for her future, she needed to fully understand her past. Her arthritic fingers trembled as she opened yet another box, this one filled with George's old papers. Bills, tax returns, and faded photographs spilled out onto the worn floorboards. But it was a small, leather-bound journal that caught Margaret's eye. "I don't remember this," she murmured, carefully opening the fragile book. Her breath caught as she recognized George's handwriting, the pages filled with entries dating back decades. As Margaret began to read, the world around her faded away. George's words painted a picture of their life together, but from a perspective she'd never known. April 15, 1975. Made the final arrangements for Maggie's trust today. It breaks my heart to keep this from her, but I know she'd never accept it if she knew. She's given up so much for our family. This is the least I can do to make sure she has a chance at those dreams someday." Tears welled in Margaret's eyes. All those years, she'd thought George was oblivious to her sacrifices. But he'd seen it all, had been planning for her future when she thought those dreams were long dead. She turned the page, her heart racing. June 3rd, 1980. Maggie found her old sketchbooks today, the look in her eyes. God, I wanted to tell her about the trust right then. But the kids need braces, and the roof is leaking. We need every penny right now. Someday, my love, someday you'll paint again. Margaret's hands shook as she flipped through the journal, each entry revealing a depth to George's love and understanding that she'd never fully grasped. But it was the final entry, dated just weeks before his death, that stopped her heart. February 10th, 2022. The doctors say there's nothing more they can do. I'm scared, not for myself, but for Maggie. I pray she finds that letter, that she uses the money to live the life she always dreamed of. My biggest regret is that I won't be there to see her shine, but I know she will. My Maggie was always meant for greatness. A sob escaped Margaret's throat, echoing in the quiet attic. All these years, she'd carried a tiny seed of resentment, believing George had never truly understood the depths of her sacrifice. Now, she realized, he'd understood all too well. As she clutched the journal to her chest, Margaret's eyes fell on a folded piece of paper that had fluttered to the floor. With trembling fingers, she opened it, revealing a letter she'd never seen before. My dearest Margaret, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and you've finally discovered the trust. There's something you need to know. The money. It's not just from our savings. Most of it came from the sale of my father's business. I never told you, but Dad left everything to me when he passed. I know how much you struggled with him, how he never approved of your art. I couldn't bear to use that money for ourselves, knowing how it would hurt you. So I locked it away, hoping that someday it could give you back the dreams you set aside for us. Maggie, my love, please don't let guilt or obligation hold you back. This money is yours, free and clear. Use it to paint, to travel, to live. You've earned it, 1,000 times over. I love you always and forever. George. Margaret's vision blurred as tears streamed down her cheeks. The revelation hit her like a physical blow. George's father, the stern, disapproving man who'd made her feel small and insignificant, had unknowingly provided the means for her to reclaim her dreams. The irony of it all was almost too much to bear. But as the initial shock faded, Margaret felt something else rising within her, a fierce determination unlike anything she'd experienced before. She thought of the apex lawyers, so quick to dismiss her claims. She thought of all the years she'd spent putting everyone else's needs before her own. And she thought of George, silently working all those years to give her this chance. With newfound resolve, Margaret carefully gathered the journal and letters. As she descended the attic stairs, she felt as though she was leaving behind more than just dusty memories. She was shedding the weight of regret, of missed opportunities, of a life half-lived. Margaret Wilson emerged from that attic, a changed woman. The path ahead was still fraught with challenges, but now she had something she'd been missing for far too long, the unshakable knowledge that she was loved, that her dreams mattered, and that it was finally her time to shine. As she reached for the phone to call James, Margaret's hand was steady, her voice clear and determined. The fight for her future was far from over, but for the first time in years, she knew without a doubt that she would win. The morning sun cast long shadows across Margaret's kitchen as she sat at her worn table, a cup of tea growing cold beside her. Spread out before her were the remnants of her past, George's journal, the trust documents, and a stack of legal papers James had sent over. The doorbell's sharp ring jolted Margaret from her reverie. She opened the door to find James standing there, his usually immaculate suit slightly rumpled, dark circles under his eyes, suggesting a sleepless night. "Mrs. Wilson," he said, his voice tight with tension, "we need to talk." As they settled in her living room, James pulled out a thick folder. "I've been up all night going through every detail of your case," he began, "and I've found something troubling." Margaret's heart sank. "What is it?" James took a deep breath. "The trust George set up. It's not as straightforward as we thought. There's a clause, buried in the legal jargon, that could complicate everything." As James explained the technicalities, Margaret felt the ground shifting beneath her. The clause, it seemed, tied the trust to George's father's business dealings that, upon closer inspection, weren't entirely above board. "What does this mean?" Margaret asked, her voice barely a whisper. James's expression was grim. "It means that if we push forward with our claim, there's a chance, a significant chance that it could trigger a larger investigation, one that could potentially implicate George in his father's questionable business practices. The implications hit Margaret like a physical blow. Her mind raced back to all those years ago, to George's strained relationship with his father, to the subtle hints of family tension she'd never fully understood. "But George would never," she began, her voice trailing off as doubt crept in. How well had she really known her husband's past? James leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. "Mrs. Wilson, I believe in your case. I believe you deserve this money, but we're at a crossroads. If we continue, there's a real possibility of tarnishing George's reputation, posthumously accusing him of fraud." Margaret's hands trembled as she reached for George's journal, flipping to the last entry she'd read. The words blurred before her eyes. "My biggest regret is that I won't be there to see her shine." A heavy silence fell over the room as the weight of the decision pressed down on Margaret's shoulders. Fight for her dreams, for the future George had wanted for her, or protect his memory, preserve the image of the man she'd loved for over half a century. I need some time," Margaret finally managed, her voice cracking. James nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Of course. But Mrs. Wilson?" "Margaret, we don't have much time. The bank's deadline is approaching fast." As James gathered his things to leave, Margaret's gaze fell on the painting she'd done in Claire's class, propped against the wall. The vibrant colors seemed to mock her now, a reminder of dreams that always seemed just out of reach. Once alone, Margaret sank into her armchair, George's journal clutched to her chest. Memories flooded her mind, their wedding day, the birth of their children, quiet evenings spent dreaming of a future they thought they had all the time in the world to realize. But mingled with those sweet recollections were darker moments, hushed arguments about money, George's inexplicable tension whenever his father was mentioned, the gradual fading of her own ambitions. As the afternoon light waned, Margaret found herself at her easel, brush in hand. Without conscious thought, she began to paint, pouring her turmoil onto the canvas. Hours passed in a blur of color and emotion. It was nearly midnight when Margaret stepped back, surveying what she'd created. The painting before her was unlike anything she'd ever done, raw, chaotic, beautiful in its pain. It was the visual representation of the choice she faced, of dreams deferred and secrets long buried. In that moment, staring at the still wet canvas, Margaret knew what she had to do. The path forward crystallized with startling clarity. With trembling fingers, she reached for her phone, dialing James's number. When his groggy voice answered, Margaret's words were clear and firm. "I've made my decision." The choice Margaret had made would shape not only her future, but the legacy of her past. As she hung up the phone, she felt the weight of decades lifting from her shoulders. Whatever came next, she would face it with the strength and courage of a woman who had finally, truly, found herself. The early morning mist hung low over Millbrook as Margaret made her way to the community centre, her steps purposeful despite the weight of her decision. She'd barely slept, but there was a newfound energy coursing through her veins, the vigor of someone who had finally chosen their path. Claire was already there, setting up for the day's class. Her eyebrows shot up in surprise when she saw Margaret. "Maggie, I didn't expect to see you today. Is everything all right?" Margaret managed a small smile. "No, Claire, everything's not all right, but I think it might be soon." As the other students filtered in, Margaret took her place at an easel, her hands steady as she arranged her brushes. She could feel Claire's concerned gaze, but she focused on the blank canvas before her, letting the chatter of the class fade into background noise. Just as Margaret was about to make her first brushstroke, the door burst open. James Hardwick stood there, slightly out of breath, his normally impeccable appearance disheveled. "Mrs. Wilson," he panted, "I'm so glad I caught you. We need to talk, now." The class fell silent, all eyes turning to Margaret. She straightened her spine, years of quiet dignity coming to the fore. "Whatever you have to say, James, you can say it here. These people, they're my friends. James hesitated, then nodded. Very well. Mrs. Wilson, I spent all night going over every detail of your case, and I found something that changes everything. Margaret's heart raced as James explained. It turned out that the questionable clause in the trust wasn't George's doing at all. It had been inserted by his father, a final attempt to maintain control even from beyond the grave. But here's the crucial part, James continued, excitement building in his voice. George knew about it, and he left a paper trail, memos, letters to lawyers, even a recorded conversation. He spent years trying to untangle this mess, to make sure you'd get what was rightfully yours, without any strings attached. Tears welled in Margaret's eyes as the full import of James's words sank in. George hadn't just set aside money for her dreams. He'd fought tooth and nail to protect those dreams, to shield her from his family's dark legacy. So what does this mean? Margaret asked, her voice barely above a whisper. James's grin was triumphant. It means we have a case, Mrs. Wilson, a strong one. George's documentation gives us leverage against Apex Financial. They'll have to release the funds or risk a very public, very messy legal battle. A collective gasp went up from the class. Claire rushed to Margaret's side, enveloping her in a fierce hug. "Oh, Maggie," she breathed, "don't you see? This is your second chance." As the reality of the situation sank in, Margaret felt a laugh bubble up from deep within her, a sound of pure joy she hadn't made in years. The other students crowded around, offering congratulations and support. But even as she basked in the moment, a quiet voice in the back of Margaret's mind whispered a reminder. She still had a choice to make. Gently extricating herself from Claire's embrace, Margaret turned to face James. The room fell silent, sensing the weight of the moment. "James," Margaret began, her voice clear and strong, "I want you to release all of George's documentation to Apex Financial." James blinked in surprise. "But Mrs. Wilson, if we do that, we lose our leverage. They could still tie up the funds in court for years." Margaret nodded, a serene smile playing at her lips. "I know, but George spent years fighting to clear his name, to separate himself from his father's misdeeds. I won't undo all that work now, not even for my own benefit." She turned to address the whole room, her gaze sweeping over the faces of her friends and fellow artists. "I've spent too many years letting fear and obligation hold me back. No more. If I have to fight Apex Financial in court for the next decade, so be it. But I'll do it honestly, and with a clear conscience." A ripple of admiration went through the group. Claire squeezed Margaret's hand, tears shining in her eyes. "That's our Maggie," she said softly. James stared at Margaret for a long moment, then slowly nodded. "Mrs. Wilson, it would be my honor to represent you in this fight. Whatever happens, we'll face it together." As the excitement in the room built, plans being made and support offered, Margaret turned back to her canvas. With a steady hand, she made her first brushstroke, bold, vibrant, full of life. The painting that emerged over the next few hours was unlike anything Margaret had ever created. It was a riot of color and emotion, hope and determination radiating from every line. At its center, barely discernible amidst the swirling patterns, was the silhouette of a woman standing tall, her arms outstretched to embrace the future. As Margaret put the finishing touches on her work, she felt a profound sense of peace settle over her. The road ahead would not be easy. The threat of losing her home still loomed, and the legal battle with Apex Financial promised to be long and difficult. But for the first time in decades, Margaret Wilson was truly, completely alive. She had rediscovered not just her passion for art, but her own inner strength. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them with courage, creativity, and the unwavering support of her newfound community. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow through the studio windows, Margaret stepped back from her easel. Claire appeared at her side, gazing at the painting in awe. "What will you call it?" she asked softly. Margaret smiled, a lifetime of dreams reawakened shining in her eyes. "Second Chances," she replied, "a tribute to George, to the life we shared, and to the future that's finally within reach. As the class began to pack up around her, Margaret remained rooted in place, drinking in every detail of her creation. In that moment, she knew with absolute certainty that regardless of the outcome with Apex Financial, she had already won the most important battle, the one to reclaim her own spirit. Margaret Wilson, artist and dreamer, had finally come home to herself, and that, she realized, was the greatest second chance of all.
Thank you very much for listening to this story. Comment below what you thought of the ending and from which city you're listening to us. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more, click on the next story that's appearing on your screen now. Leave your like and subscribe to our channel so we can build a huge community that shares inspiring stories together. See you soon.